Yeah.
Here's Dan Bleakley. Dan, welcome to the Sustainable Hour.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Tell us about this top 10 that you did there on Twitter.
Yeah, so it was just great listening to Dino and Edwina talk about their solutions, which are really community-based solutions, and really believe that community solutions are the most important ones, because obviously you've got the heat island one, which has a physical positive impact on climate, but it's also bringing people closer together in their communities, and the same with what Dino's doing as well. So what we've been looking at, so I met Tony through Extinction Rebellion, so I've been an activist for over a year now, and with the lockdown, like a lot of activists, been quite frustrated not being able to get out there. So we've really tried to look at different options, and myself and some friends of mine kind of put our heads together and decided we'd really attack social media. And one thing in particular is corruption. And we sort of identified the fact that we all know that there's all these corruption scandals are out there. And we hear about them, every week we'll hear a different one, and we'll get little bits of information about a particular scandal. But there's nowhere we can go to actually see all of the corruption scandals in one place. And that's what we tried to do with that thread. So that the first one was a 17-piece thread, and it took us, we came up with the idea 2 weeks ago on a Friday morning at about 9 o'clock. And we just said we should make a thread with all these tiles like memes, and we'll look at each one of the corruption scandals, and we'll go into it, and we'll try to reduce that scandal down to 3 points, just so that it makes it easy for people to understand, because a lot of these things are extremely complex. And we came up with, it took us 16 hours. We decided we were going to release it on the Saturday, so we're up till 2 a.m. We came up with 17 of these memes, and we were by no means through the whole list. And we posted it on Twitter the following day, and we've had over 100,000 impressions from people liking and sharing these tiles. And then we decided, we had all these people saying, you forgot about this one, you forgot about this one. So then we did a second series a week later with another 7. And we're currently working on a series of 20, which don't look at corruption per se, but they look at the connections between individual politicians and the fossil fuel industry. And what we've discovered there is rather sickening. So we've looked into people like Alexander Downer, and how he's started a lobbying firm a year after exiting government, a lobbying firm which represents Woodside Petroleum, Santos, and some of the major oil and gas companies in Australia. And then how he's connected to, some of the people who've worked for these lobbying groups, these fossil fuel lobbying groups, have ended up as key advisors in the government. And some of Scott Morrison's top advisors have come from these particular lobby groups. And this is all, I've followed the climate crisis for 20 years, and I've never really dove into these political connections. And so what we're trying to do, we've started a new organization just a few weeks ago called Access Disrupt. And our goal is to try to condense these really complex issues into memes that people can really see the scale and the connections that are within the government. That's our goal, yeah.
And you had no idea that this is where it would go when you started?
No, we didn't. I've always known that there's corruption in the government, but I've never looked into who are the actual people who are facilitating this corruption. And I dropped a link in there in the chat there. But that's the first one that we did, and the new one that we're about to release will release on Friday. We've actually put all the logos of the different organisations in there. So there's like the Australian Petroleum organisation, APP. I forget the full acronym, but they represent 10 different coal, oil and gas companies, and it's just a revolving door. And there's just so many names in both Labor and Liberal Party that have either come from that group, or they end up going into one of these organisations within a year after they've finished. people, you know, Angus Taylor's the obvious one, but he worked for the Minerals Council before entering Parliament. But there's also, there's people across the board. There's just so many, and we've been working with, I don't know if people have heard of Michael West, the journalist Michael West.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we've had a couple of long Zoom sessions with Michael West, because we're getting a lot of the information from him. So he's done a lot of work over the years to expose this sort of corruption. So he has a lot of the stuff on his website. It's just people aren't seeing it because people are using social media to get their information. And so we're trying to create a new type of media, which is really suits 2020, where people aren't going to go and read a 10-minute article on a particular corruption scandal. We want to condense that down into a 30-second, get the key points. This person's connected to this organization. This person's connected to this organization. This organization represents the top 4 oil companies in Australia. This is clearly corruption. Next one. Okay, here's another politician that you know of. They're connected to this person, blah, blah, blah. So our goal, we say in our description that we're trying to synthesize complex issues into digestible memes, basically. So it's a very new concept, but there is so much content that we think we could work for a year just on some of the stuff. It's overwhelming. And we've actually, some days I've worked, you know, for 8 or 10 hours and stuff. And then I just feel physically sick. It's just shocking to see when you dig into it.
I'm delighted, first of all, Daniel, that you are, if you like, taking the tinsel off of what they call lobbying and lobby groups and calling it for what it is, corruption. When you put money into a political party and then they back your ideas, that's corruption. Have you made it available on any other platform except for Twitter? Where else are you going to be putting it? Because I mean, the most powerful of all the social medias is Facebook. Will they allow you on it?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And to your first point, I agree with you 100%. We have to use the word corruption. It is corruption. And for some reason, Australian journalists seem to be afraid to use the word corruption. And that's why since the lockdown, I've really tried to learn a lot about Twitter. So comparing Twitter and Facebook is quite interesting. So Twitter, both platforms are very powerful and both of them work in obviously very different ways, but we see Twitter as a big opportunity to connect with journalists, because things on Twitter trend. You get your top 10 trends, and whatever's trending, the journalists kind of have to move into that space. They have to, Twitter is kind of starting to lead the daily agenda. And if a journalist wants to stay relevant, they have to get around those top trending topics. And that's why I've been telling a lot of my activist friends to get involved in Twitter and push their agenda, follow the journalists, follow the key journalists of all the media, Sky News, Channel 9, Channel 7, in the ABC as well. If you see them commenting on something, get in there and say, well, why aren't you questioning the government on their fossil fuel corruption? Why aren't you questioning the government on their lack of action on climate policy? Even if you don't have any followers, it doesn't matter, because these journalists will scan through their comments. And if they're seeing a lot of comments that are suggesting that they're not going hard enough on climate change, eventually they'll have to. So the strategy on Twitter is to influence the journalists, and the journalists then will influence the mainstream media. And then the strategy on Facebook is slightly more direct. You're going direct to the end consumer of that information. And to answer your question, we have put all of those memes into Facebook format. I'll drop a link into the chat so you can check them out. We've tried to make the memes really colorful. So there'll be a red one, then a yellow one, then a green one. And each one has a picture of the politician in question, and then just, boils it down to very basic, simple points.
Great. Hey, Daniel, that sounds really, really interesting. Dino Goodbrew here again. I'm so passionate about what you're talking about. I'm constantly trying to make people aware of the corruption in our politics, and it is disgusting. It makes me sick. Now, and the funny thing is that when Edwina was talking about doing a project in Downer, my whole body just fucking tensed up, and because Alexander Downer makes me sick, he makes me ill. He seems very anti-humanity. So, and my first reaction to the name of that suburb was, when are we going to have some form of a trial against these climate criminals, these corrupt politicians that have allowed our country to get so far backwards when it comes to climate policy, and when will we change the name of that suburb? You know, I imagine it's named after him as a high-ranking bureaucrat. You know, so it's funny how it all ties in together, you know, like that was the example.
Dino,
Yes.
Dino, Downer would be at least 50 years old. So I assume Alexander Downer was maybe 18 or so then. So I was just going to look him up, but it's obviously named after someone else, but I get your sense.
But Alexander Downer's grandfather was in Parliament.
Okay.
Yeah, and was one of the and committed some of the most atrocious crimes against traditional owners.
Wow.
Absolutely atrocious history in the Downer family, and it goes back a long way.
It does. His daughter ran last election.
Right.
Just a matter of interest around Alexander. His claim to fame was when he was foreign minister was. And he boasted openly about it, how he really stuck it up East Timor. That's the measure of that man. And so I was with a group of people who went in to question a company called Lakes Oil about their fracking plans, and Alexander poked his head out of the door, out the back.
Yep, that's actually, Tony, it's funny that you mentioned that, because that is actually on our one of our cards for the next release, and I'm just going to drop it into the chat right now. The Lakes Oil, Alexander Downer was a chairman of Lakes Oil.
Yeah, he was very sheepish.
So
it's owned by Gina Reinhardt.
And they're trying to frack Victoria. I chatted to one of the managers of Lakes Oil. He's trying to tell me, it's safe. It's not. They're not using pressure to get the gas out of the ground. They're doing something else. It was just all spin, you know. And I was like, anyway, you try and talk to them about renewables, and they steer you off it.
So Alexander Downer, a month before he resigned from Parliament, he co-founded the fossil fuel lobby group called Bespoke Approach with some other former LNP politicians. And Bespoke has lobbied the Australian government on behalf of oil and gas companies Woodside Petroleum, Santos, and PetroChina, as well as the coal company Xstrata, which is now owned by Glencore. So the lobbying company that Alexander co-founded, one of their biggest clients is Santos, which is the fourth largest oil company in Australia, and Woodside, which is the second largest oil company in Australia. And the links to East Timor are very, very interesting, because that a lot of you probably know that the Australian government has been, was caught bugging the East Timorese government, and that those negotiations on borders, those offshore borders, had a big impact on the oil reserves that were available to Australian oil companies like Santos. So it is obscene. It is blatant fossil fuel industry corruption. And what they rely on is the media not reporting it to the masses. So they don't really care if a small group of people know about this kind of stuff. If the main mass media channels aren't reporting it, then they're safe. So what we think is that in 2020, with the development of social media and people being able to use social media much more effectively than what they used to be able to, that's the media landscape is changing. So you're seeing in the United States now a number of channels that are popping up on YouTube, like The Hill. It's a political channel They've got hundreds of thousands of viewers. Things like Friendly Geordies here in Australia. Friendly Geordies has 400,000 subscribers, and more people are following Friendly Geordies than some Sky News programs. So there's a shift that's happening away from mass media to independent, truly independent media. And the platform is now there for those independent media organizations to share their content through Twitter. And if it's good content and people share it, it'll get more views than the mass media. So the mass media is losing their power, which is great. So we need to really drive that and promote independent media. And then we, we can set the agenda. We can set the narrative.